To begin with, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this presentation, particularly Dr. Janowski. A few months ago when Thomas contacted me and asked me if I would be interested in attending the conference and give a presentation, I answered that of course I would be happy to attend and honored to give a presentation, but I also quickly added, the problem is that I'm not really a specialist of e-governance, to which Thomas told me, well, not being a specialist is not an issue. In fact, this could be more an asset than a liability, because what we would want from you is a presentation sharing with the audience some of your thoughts on what a practitioner and academic like you, who over the years has spent much time working on questions of authority and legitimacy at the national and international levels, has to say on how ICT and e-governance impact questions of authority and legitimacy. And so this is what I'm going to try to do this morning in the 25 or 30 minutes or so that I have been given for this presentation. And so what I plan to do this morning is simply to give you a bit of an overview of some of the problems that, in my opinion, e-governance encounters today in relations with questions of authority and legitimacy. And more specifically, I plan to touch upon three main points this morning. First, I would like to somewhat challenge a bit the assumption that ICT applied to governance, government, and public administration nationally and internationally is always and by definition contributing to make governance, government, and public administration better. And here I will indicate that for, of course, all the qualities and the added value of e-governance, which I don't overlook and underestimate, the positive nature of e-governance is not all there is to e-governance. There are also problematic aspects to which I think we should not ignore. Second, I will try to refer to the paradoxical situation of e-governance today. On the one hand, e-governance aims at improving the effectiveness, credibility, and legitimacy of governance, government, and public administration at the local, national, and more at the international level. But on the other hand, e-governance is happening at a time when the effectiveness, credibility, and legitimacy of actors and institutions of governance, especially at the national level, appear to be increasingly weakened, undermined, and even devaluated by transnational actors, transnational economic and technological forces, for instance. And I think this is an interesting paradox. And this will lead me to say that this state of affairs runs the risk of having governance, of having e-governance, yes, improving governance, but perhaps only in the margins. And as such, I will argue that it is possible that e-governance is not enough to perhaps fully deliver the boost of credibility, if you will, that actors and institutions of governance and government are in desperate need of today. And third and finally, I'll just suggest a few ideas, including a few principles and practical recommendations to go beyond this state of affairs. So let me begin with my first point, the idea of challenging a bit ICT and what I call e-governance optimism. And so, of course, there is no doubt that in the past 20 years or so, ICT has revolutionized economic and social relations at all levels within and among societies. And of course, in the process, it is also changing deeply public and even political relations. And in this regard, e-governance has been explicitly presented as a way to ensure that the changes brought about by ICT facilitate and ultimately improve the ability of governments, public administration, to administer and govern. It is meant to be the goal, right? And this is why and how I think the narrative of e-governance has put forward an agenda, an intellectual and policy agenda revolving around several key goals and principles. These key goals and principles being, as we all know, increased transparency, increased access to information, increased participation and engagement of administered people and citizens, and increased effectiveness. And it is with these goals and principles in mind that I think e-governance has been seen as an essential contributor to the enhancement of the effectiveness of the acts and institutions of governance. And of course, it is true that in line with these goals and principles, e-governance, where it has been applied at the local, national, and international levels, has truly made a positive difference in the past years. I mean, this is clear, and I'll simply give you here an example borrowed from my own experience. Prior to being a professor in a US university, I worked for the French Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the European Union, and then the UN. And when I started working in these institutions, in fact, the information was not circulating very well externally and internally. Externally, it was very difficult for the public to have information on the mandates and the work of these institutions. Now, in contrast, this is something which has changed a lot. There is a huge amount of data on the respective website when it comes to these institutions. And this availability of data, which of course, for which of course there is still a lot of progress to be made, has been, I think, particularly important for international organizations, especially the UN. For instance, ever since the UN was created, it has struggled with dispersing public information, with projecting to the wider world, if you will, a sense of what it does. And equally troubling is the fact that it has also been very difficult for scholars of international organizations to have access to data on the UN. So the fact that there is so much information now available on the UN website has truly been for the UN, to some extent, a game changer. And as for internal communications, intranet, for instance, for the UN, for the European Union, I think has also played an important role. And this is significant because in the end, if these institutions or institutions of governance in general are not capable of self-governing themselves properly, how could they be able ever to govern the world that they are, or administer the world that they are supposed to help administer and govern? So if you will, this is the positive side of the story, but of course, it seems to me that this account of the positive impact of e-governance is only part of the picture. For I think that there are a number of reasons now for us not to be as optimistic as we may have been a few years ago concerning the power of positive transformation, if you will, that can be generated and expressed by e-governance. And indeed, in recent years, I think that the evolution of e-governance and a number of issues associated with it have introduced the need to be a bit more cautious, a bit more lucid, if you will, about what e-governance can do and what it cannot do. Yes, on the one hand, e-governance has made the world of governance and government and public administration more transparent, more accessible. But on the other hand, we should not be overlooking what is, I think, also the problematic track record of ICT and e-governance. And to at the same time make and illustrate this point, I just want to refer to 4 issues here very quickly: accountability, automatization of administrative acts and transactions, third, empowerment, and fourth, democratization. Well, first, accountability. We were talking about it yesterday evening while having dinner in a nice restaurant here in downtown Guimarães. It's not sure that the rise of e-governance has improved the ability of public institutions to be more accountable, both at the national level and international level. In fact, now we probably know more about the lack of accountability of these organizations, but it doesn't make accountability greater for this. So that's just one issue that I think that we should have to think about. Second, automatization. Well, years ago, as an administered person, as a average user of public administration, I used to spend a lot of time in public offices in France and in the US, queuing for a person to handle my dossier and application of the day. Well, today, for sure, this is less the case, but in the end, I spent a lot of time at home or in my office filling up administrative forms online before submitting them online or in person. And here, my point is that e-governance in the form of automatization of procedures and of administrative acts and transactions has certainly simplified and lessened the work of the actors and institutions of governance, has simplified and lessened their burden, but it has not necessarily simplified and lessened the burden of the customer. In fact, one could argue that very often, these acts are being outsourced to the customer, which I think is a bit of a problem. Now, what about, so this is what I wanted to say about automatization. Now, what about e-governance and the empowerment of individuals? In this regard, it is true that availability and access to information made possible by various aspects of e-governance are really good things. It certainly widens the possibility for people to take their life into their own hands, know more about opportunities, and therefore have more opportunities. But this doesn't mean necessarily that e-governance has fully opened deep participation and engagement of administered people and citizens in the decision-making processes of governance, of e-governance and of governance. After all, one could argue that e-governance remains, by and large, a rather traditional way of conceiving and administering governance. It remains, by and large, traditional in the sense that it remains, by and large, I think, quite a top-down and one-way street of doing things, with the administered and citizens being asked to and guided to follow procedure rather than being put in the position of being more able to decide and what the procedure should be, let alone what the substance of the procedure should be. So I think that, think about the European Union, which has a leading position when it comes to e-governance. So even though, the European Union, for which I used to work, is very committed to e-governance, there is still a huge and perhaps a growing question of democratic deficit. So clearly, we have a problem here. And so in itself, this is, all these issues are already an invitation to caution concerning the claim that e-governance is revolutionizing, turning the table around, if you will, when it comes to the relationship between the governor and the governed. All this is already an element of caution concerning the democratizing powers of e-governance. But I think there is also perhaps an even greater risk when it comes to ICT and governance, and the ability of ICT to nurture and facilitate democratization and democracy. And this greater risk is the one having to do with the ever-growing culture of global surveillance. I don't know how it is in Europe, but for sure in the US, this is something which has been happening in the past 10 years and even more so in the past 5 years. And of course, in this perspective, last year, Snowden's revelations on the extent to which the US government uses the internet and the data generated by ICT companies to pursue its national security agenda, its national security obsession, in fact, its national security paranoia, has sent a chilling message around the world. Nobody in the end is out of reach when it comes to the national security agenda, obsessed culture in the US, and in this regard, ICT is at the same time making this possible, in fact, complicit to it. Indeed, Snowden's revelation have unveiled the extent to which and the rather incredible and frankly quite sickening extent to which this is happening. And I should add here that equally disturbing perhaps and worrying in terms of the obstacles that ICT can generate concerning democratization and democracy is also, of course, how the corporate sector acquires and sells private data to increase their reach to consumers. Once again, I don't know what's happening here in Europe on this specific issue, but in the US it's a bit mind-boggling. So obviously, and more generally, none of this speaks in favor of the supposed alliance between ICT and democracy and democratization, and of the nurturing and enhancing power of ICT concerning the agency of people. ICT may facilitate and is indeed facilitating agency and democratization in many ways, but in other ways, and at times in other very, very big ways, ICT and its culture is also empowering agency and democratization. And this brings me to my second point, the one concerning e-governance and the crisis of legitimacy of public institutions. And on this point, I'll be a bit more brief. So assuming that e-governance manages to drastically increase the effectiveness, credibility, and legitimacy of modern governance, which I just said is far from being sure, there is, I think, another problem with e-governance, and perhaps a more fundamental one. And indeed here the question could be the following. What is the ultimate value of improving governance, government, and public administration, and public administrative acts and transactions via ICT, and of course e-governance, if the meaning and the value of these transactions are less and less meaningful, so to speak, are less and less valuable, and this because, and I think this is something which is really happening in many places, and this because governments, public institutions, and official governance, if you will, have less of an impact, are less and less important in the life of people. So in other words, here the key question, the key concern is the following. What is the real improvement of governance, government, public administration brought about by ICT and e-governance if governance, government, and public administrations are themselves less and less in a position to govern and administer the life of people? What is the value of e-governance if it can only govern and administer routine administrative and local matters and is more or less powerless to address and improve the big picture of governance and government? And of course, I am not here saying that that routine administrative and local matters are not important. In fact, at their own level, they are hugely important. We all know that. But they tend to only make full sense when they are part of a big picture that itself makes sense. And it is precisely on the questions of governance and e-governance in relation with the big picture that I think today we have a real problem. Indeed, when one sees the increasing power that transnational private actors, for instance, in the world of finance and technologies have over the ways of life and thinking of people, when one sees how and the extent to which these transnational actors are challenging the traditional powers of the nation state, and arguably the positive powers of the nation state, one has to wonder how the big picture impact the e-governance and the real improvement that e-governance amounts to in the end in connection with this big picture. So clearly, to be sure, the situation in which we find ourselves today in this regard is not a totally new problem. In fact, the technology and economic private actors have always been a source of challenge, positive and negative, for institutions and actors of governance and government. Public institutions have always had to cope with technology innovation, while in fact very often they make, this is the irony, technology innovation possible through investment and all kinds of ways. So public institutions have always had to cope with technology innovation and regulate private market forces to ensure that these do not function in an exclusively self-centered manner. And as a matter of fact, it is from this role of control and regulation and from being good at it that public institutions derive in a large part their legitimacy and credibility. But it seems to me that in the past 15 years or so, public authority and legitimacy have been, more than perhaps ever before, put on the defensive by technology and private market forces. And it's not sure, in fact, that in the battle unfolding today, these public institutions are winning the battle. Perhaps they are losing the battle. And fittingly for this presentation, interestingly also, two types of technology and private market forces are playing a key role in challenging the credibility and legitimacy of public institutions, at least once again in the US, where I am based in these days, ICT companies and financial companies. And interestingly, these two types are very much working together and joining forces in challenging public institutions and their role of regulation. And on this specific point, four quick elements can help us to have a sense of how this is happening in terms of challenging or in terms of having the credibility and legitimacy of public institutions being challenged. First, today, ICT companies are in a commanding position in terms of technology innovation, and as such, they are in a large measure dictating the terms of the evolution of society, including to the governance structures and institutions within and among societies. And as such, institutions of governance and government are not really in charge. More than anything else, they are at the receiving end of the power and influence of ICT. And once again, this is something very much at work in the US, where you have a lot of strong culture, and even more so in the US, because over there you have a strong culture of innovation, but you have a weak culture of public policy. So this is a bit of a problem. In Europe, it seems it's the other way around. You have a relatively weak culture of innovation, but a strong culture of public policy. We can talk about it, it's important, I think. Second element illustrating this challenge, the financialization, what we call the financialization of the economy, that is the fact that financial transactions are now taking place around the clock, and with a rather remote connection with the real economy and long-term investment policies designed for the overall growth of countries. So the financialization of the economy is giving to the financial sector the possibility to play huge political and policy functions within and among societies. And moreover, this financialization of the economy has been made possible by ICT. I mean, without ICT, what has been called prior to 2008 the modernization of the financial sector wouldn't have happened. Third, as the financial sector and ICT companies have become more and more powerful and influential, and as governments have become less and less able to administer and govern in their own strategic traditional areas, it happens that the financial sector and ICT companies, once again, at least in the US, are playing a growing policy role and political role, roles for which they have no mandate, and yet they are playing it. And so, logically, on the other side, institutions of governance are less and less able to play the governance role for which they are mandated and from which they derive their legitimacy, credibility, and existence in principle. Fourth and finally, both ICT and financial sector companies are more and more pushing forward a libertarian, what we could call a libertarian agenda, especially, but not only in the US. In this context, the government and the institutions of governance are supposed to get out of the way, to step aside, and let the technology and financial forces enjoy as much freedom as possible. And clearly today, both ICT and financial sector companies have the economic and financial resources to lobby and even corrupt governments to ensure that legislation is as little intrusive as possible to their interest. And in fact, the privatization, what we could also call the hijacking by corporate interest of lawmaking and politics in the US is part of the story. I mean, you know, I teach law in the US, and for me it's mind-boggling once again to see how lawmaking is happening in Congress in these days. So, hence, following the 2008 financial crisis, the current situation, which would be funny if it were not tragic, can be summarized in the following terms. Governments and institutions of governance had to bail out the financial sector, which in part got in trouble because of the modernization of financial transactions and flows made possible by ICT, don't forget this, while at the same time, technology and financial sectors forces are working hard to curtail the power of governance, of regulation of public institutions. So, I mean, ultimately, we are here in a situation which is quite destructive, if not self-destructive for everybody. So let me finish my presentation with a few concluding ideas, including a few suggestions for the way forward concerning e-governance and the possible contribution of e-governance to better governance and government. And here I will limit myself to 2 quick points. First, in putting forward the considerations of caution I mentioned in this presentation on ICT and e-governance, it's not my intention to walk in the footsteps of the naysayers, as we say in the US, and adversaries of technology in general, and of ICT and e-governance in particular. Even less so do I want to be or to pass for a prophet of doom. The truth of the matter is that, like anybody else, I see great virtues and added value in technology, in ICT and e-governance. But I just want us to be cautious, not naively optimistic. I just want us to be aware of the need to think about the 2 sides of technology, of ICT, of e-governance, the positive and the negative sides, and make sure that the reasons for why we celebrate technology, ICT, and e-governance because of their good and positive sides. So I just want to make sure that by being more lucid, these positive sides prevail and even shape further governance and government tomorrow. At the moment, it seems to me that the glass of ICT and e-governance is as much half empty as it is full. So I just want us to to see and deal with a glass of ICT and e-governance which would be less empty, which would be fuller, so to speak. So, because in the end, you know, ICT and e-governance can have incredible liberating and empowering effects, but they are not necessarily panacea. They have their limitations, and as I mentioned in this presentation, they can be debilitating and alienating, including for the credibility and legitimacy of public institutions. So, if it is where we are today, what to do for the way forward? What to do to facilitate and nurture the empowering effect powers of ICT, including in terms of the ability to generate and express and project private and public goods, and combats the non-empowering, the destructive, the debilitating, if you will, features of ICT and ICT, yes. And this is where perhaps e-governance can help, and can help in fundamental ways. But for this to be possible, the ways of e-governance and the conception of e-governance perhaps have to change. As I alluded to in my presentation, at the moment, ICT is very much viewed as a way to improve governance. As such, ICT means that it is conceived of and used as a means, and governance is the end, right? However, as I just said, the reality is that all too often, ICT is not simply a means, especially when working in tandem with powerful actors more focused on their own interest and on their own logic, on their own culture, than on the community at large. And so when this is the case, you know, ICT is an end, and one that undermines the credibility and legitimacy of governance and government, as I said. And so in order for this to be overcome, we have to begin to think about the trade-offs and the downsides associated with using ICT and making it central and occupying the fore the way we did it so far. So, and I think as a way to do so, a more lucid culture when it comes to e-governance in its theory and practice could only help to balance better the power of empowerment and the power of alienation, if you will, of ICT. I mean, ICT and web technologies are very attractive. They are attractive because they create great opportunities to people and institutions of governance, but at the same time, the greatness of these opportunities is also what makes them a threat. If not really addressed in a balanced and lucid fashion, you know, they can create a worldwide web in which, through which, and of which people and actors of governance can end up being captive. So I think that what is key for us for the way forward is to think about these issues, and once again to bring together the two sides of the story as a way to perhaps be actors of a more fully positive story for the way forward. So I'll stop here. I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.